The wind came down from the broken spine ridge like something with teeth. It carved through the pines and rattled the bare branches of the cottonwoods along the wash. Tobias McCrae rode with his collar turned up and his hat pulled low, the brim shadowing a face that had forgotten how to show much of anything anymore. He was 44 years old and looked older. The war had left its marks. So had the years after. His right shoulder sat stiff where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone at Chickamauga back in '63. On cold days like this, the joint locked up like a rusted hinge. He had learned to live with it the way a man learns to live with a limp or a scar that never quite fades. The horse beneath him was a buckskin gelding named Drummer, steady and patient, the kind of animal that didn't spook easy. They had been together 6 years now. The horse knew the trails around Red Willow as well as Tobias did, maybe better. It was late afternoon in the Arizona Territory, winter of 1883. The sky hung low and gray, pregnant with snow that had not yet decided to fall. The air tasted like iron and ice. Tobias had been riding fence line all morning, checking posts and wire looking for breaks where cattle might wander through. It was mindless work, the kind that let a man's thoughts drift without landing anywhere dangerous. He preferred it that way. Then he heard the gunshots, 2 of them, sharp cracks that echoed off the canyon walls and rolled through the trees like distant thunder. Tobias reined Drummer to a halt and sat listening. The wind died for a moment, and in that stillness he heard nothing else. No shouts, no return fire, just silence. He waited another full minute, counting his heartbeats. Then he turned Drummer north and kicked him into a trot. The shots had come from the direction of the old Trapper's Trail, a narrow track that wound through the rocks and scrub oak toward the high country. It was rough ground, the kind most sensible men avoided in winter. Tobias had not ridden it in months. He found the bodies a quarter-mile up the trail. 2 men lay sprawled in the snow, their limbs twisted at angles that only death allows. Both were face down. The snow around them was dark with blood still fresh enough to steam faintly in the cold air. Tobias dismounted slowly, his hand moving by instinct to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. He scanned the rocks above the tree line, the shadows between the junipers. Nothing moved. The silence pressed down like a weight. He approached the first body and knelt. The man was young, maybe 25, with a patchy beard and cheap boots. A rifle lay 3 feet from his outstretched hand, a Henry repeater that had seen better days. Tobias rolled him over with the toe of his boot. An arrow had punched clean through the man's throat. The fletching was sinew-wrapped, the shaft painted with red and black bands. Apache work, no question about it. The second man was older, heavier, with a leather coat and a gun belt that held a Remington revolver and a skinning knife. He had been shot in the back just below the shoulder blade. The exit wound in his chest was the size of a fist. Tobias checked the body for papers, found none. No identification, no letters, nothing to say who these men had been or what they were doing out here. But he knew. Bounty hunters, had to be. The territory was crawling with them these days, men with hard eyes and empty pockets looking to collect rewards on Apache scalps, or runaway slaves, or anyone the law had decided was worth more dead than alive. $50 for an Apache warrior, $25 for a woman, $10 for a child. Tobias had never understood that kind of arithmetic. He stood and looked around more carefully, now reading the ground the way the cavalry had taught him 20 years ago. The snow was trampled and scuffed, churned up by boots and struggle. There were tracks leading away from the bodies heading north into the rocks. Small tracks, barefoot. 1 person, moving fast but not steady. The stride was uneven, the left foot dragging slightly every 3rd or 4th step. Injured. Tobias followed the tracks with his eyes until they disappeared into a tumble of boulders 50 yards uphill. Whoever had killed these men was still out here, probably watching him right now from some hidden vantage point. He felt the weight of unseen eyes like a hand on the back of his neck. He could leave. Ride back to the ranch, forget he had seen anything. It was not his business. It had not been his business for a long time, but his feet did not move. Instead, he turned back to the bodies and began covering them with loose rocks and branches, enough to keep the coyotes off, until someone official could be bothered to collect them. It took him 20 minutes. The whole time he kept expecting a bullet or an arrow to find him, but nothing came. When he was finished, he mounted Drummer and rode back the way he had come. The snow began to fall as he reached the valley floor, fat flakes that drifted down in silence and settled on his shoulders like ash. By the time he reached the ranch, twilight had turned the world gray and indistinct. The buildings emerged from the gloom like ghosts. There was the main cabin, low and solid, built from logs he had cut himself, the barn and the corral, the chicken coop, the small shed where he kept tools and tack, and on the hill above it all 2 graves marked with simple wooden crosses. Tobias unsaddled Drummer and rubbed him down, working by feel in the dim light of the barn. He fed the horse grain and hay, checked the water trough, latched the stall door. The familiar motions steadied him. Inside the cabin, he did not light the stove. He sat in the dark and drank coffee cold from the pot he had made that morning. The room smelled of old smoke and leather and the faint mustiness of a place where only one person lived. There were 2 chairs at the table. He had never gotten rid of the second one. On the shelf above the fireplace sat a framed photograph, the glass dusty and cracked at one corner. A woman with dark hair and serious eyes. A little girl with a ribbon in her hair, smiling. Tobias did not look at it. He thought about the tracks in the snow, the uneven stride, the blood. He thought about the 2 men lying dead under a pile of rocks. He thought about how easy it would be to do nothing. But when dawn came cold and pale through the window, Tobias was already saddled and riding north again. The tracks were still there, half buried under fresh snow, but readable if a man knew what to look for. Tobias followed them into the rocks, dismounting where the trail grew too steep and narrow for a horse. He went on foot, his breath pluming white in the frozen air. The tracks led him to a shallow cave tucked beneath an overhang of red sandstone. He could smell wood smoke, faint but unmistakable. He stopped 20 feet from the opening and called out in a voice that carried but did not echo, "I am not here to hurt you. I found the men you killed. They deserved it, I expect. I am alone and unarmed." That last part was a lie. The Colt was still on his hip, but he kept his hands where they could be seen. Silence answered him. Then a voice, thin and rough, spoke from the darkness. "Go away." The words were in English, accented but clear, a woman's voice. "You are hurt," Tobias said. "I can help. I do not need help from white men. Maybe not. But you will not last 3 more days out here alone. That leg is bad. I can smell the infection from here." Another silence, longer this time, then movement in the shadows, and she emerged into the gray morning light. She was small, maybe 5 feet tall, wrapped in a blanket that might have been blue once, but was now the color of old blood. Her hair was black and matted with dirt and pine needles. Her face was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp beneath skin the color of copper. Her eyes were dark and fierce and utterly without hope. She held a knife in her right hand, the blade trembling. Her left leg was wrapped in filthy cloth, dark with dried blood. She could barely stand. "You will kill me, or you will leave," she said. "But you will not take me." Tobias looked at her for a long moment. He saw the way she held herself upright through sheer will, the way her jaw was set, the way her hand gripped that knife like it was the last solid thing in a world that had gone to water. He thought about Sarah. He thought about Emma. He thought about what it meant to choose. "I will take you to my cabin," he said quietly. "I will treat that leg. When you are well enough to leave, you can go. No one will know you were there. You have my word." She stared at him. Her hand did not lower. "Why?" Tobias had no answer that made sense, so he told the truth. "I do not know." She swayed on her feet, and for a moment he thought she would fall. but she caught herself against the rock wall and stayed upright. The knife clattered to the ground. "If you lie," she whispered, "I will kill you in your sleep." Fair enough. He stepped forward and lifted her as carefully as he could. She weighed almost nothing, all bone and sinew and stubborn will. She did not speak or cry out even when his hand brushed the wounded leg, and she must have felt pain like fire. By the time they reached Drummer, she had passed out. Tobias rode slow and steady. Back to the ranch, the woman cradled in front of him like something fragile. The snow fell heavier now, erasing their tracks as fast as they were made. The woman did not wake when Tobias carried her into the cabin. He laid her on the narrow bed in the corner and began cutting away the filthy cloth wrapped around her leg. The stench hit him immediately, sweet and rotten. The wound was 4 days old, at least maybe 5. A jagged gash ran from her ankle nearly to her knee, deep enough that he could see the white gleam of bone in places. She had tried to stitch it herself with what looked like sinew and a bone needle. The stitches were crude but competent, the work of someone who had done field medicine before. But infection had set in anyway. The skin around the wound was hot and swollen, streaked with angry red lines. Tobias worked quickly. He built up the fire until the room was warm, then set water to boil. While he waited, he assembled what he needed. A bottle of whiskey, clean cloth torn into strips, a curved needle and thread, a razor-sharp skinning knife sterilized in the flames. When the water was ready, he washed his hands and began. First, he cleaned the wound, pouring boiling water over the torn flesh until the woman jerked awake with a gasp that was almost a scream. Her eyes flew open, wild and unfocused. Tobias caught her wrists before she could claw at him. "Hold still," he said, his voice steady. "This will hurt, but it has to be done." She stared at him for 3 heartbeats, then nodded once. She grabbed a piece of leather from the bedpost and bit down hard. Tobias poured whiskey into the wound. Her whole body went rigid. A sound came from behind the leather, low and animal, but she did not pull away. He worked for the better part of an hour. He cut away the dead tissue, irrigated the wound again, inspected for foreign objects. He found a splinter of wood buried deep in the muscle, no bigger than a thorn, but enough to poison the whole leg. He extracted it with tweezers and dropped it into a dish. Then he began stitching. 14 sutures, neat and tight. The cavalry had taught him this too. 4th Cavalry Sergeant attached to the surgeon's detail after Chickamauga. He had stitched up more men than he could count in field hospitals and burning barns and muddy ditches under fire. His hands remembered the work even when his mind did not want to. When he tied off the last stitch and bandaged the leg with clean cloth, the woman had gone pale as milk. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but she had not cried out, not once. 14 years in the cavalry, Tobias said quietly, more to himself than to her. Taught me more than most doctors know. She let the leather fall from her mouth and looked at him with eyes that were slightly clearer now. You were a soldier. A long time ago. You killed my people. It was not a question. Tobias did not flinch from it. Yes. She studied his face, looking for something. He did not know what. And now you save one. Now I save one. She closed her eyes. I do not understand white men. That makes 2 of us. He gave her water to drink, then a tin cup of broth made from venison and wild onions. She drank it in small sips, her hands shaking. When the cup was empty, she lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling. My name is Nalin, she said. Tobias McCrae. Why did you bring me here, Tobias McCrae? He had been asking himself the same question since the moment he found her. There were a dozen practical reasons not to. She was Apache, and the territory was at war with the Apache. Harboring her could get him arrested, or worse. She had killed 2 men, and there would be others looking for her. Bounty hunters did not give up easy when money was involved, and yet. You reminded me of someone, he said finally. Who? But he could not answer that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Instead, he stood and walked to the window. Outside, the snow was falling in earnest now, thick and fast. The world beyond the glass was disappearing into white. "You will stay here until that leg heals," he said. 3 weeks, maybe 4. You will not leave the cabin. If anyone comes, you will hide. When you are strong enough to ride, I will give you a horse and supplies. Then you go your own way, and we never see each other again." "Agreed." Nalin was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded. "Agreed." Tobias made up a bed for himself on the floor near the fire. He gave her the cot, the blankets, the pillow. It seemed only fair. She was the one who had been sleeping in a cave. That night he lay awake, listening to her breathe. The sound was ragged at first, hitching with pain, but it grew steadier as the hours passed. Somewhere past midnight she began to snore softly, and Tobias felt something loosen in his chest. He stared at the dying embers and thought about the photograph on the shelf. Sarah with her serious eyes, Emma with her ribbon. He had not looked at it in 7 years, not since the day he buried them both on the hill above the ranch. It had been summer, then 1876. The fever had come fast, burning through them in less than a week. Sarah first, then Emma 3 days later. Tobias had ridden hard to Tucson, for a doctor pushed his horse until it nearly dropped. But the doctor had been away on another call, and by the time Tobias made it back to Red Willow, both of them were already gone. Too late, always too late. He had buried them himself, digging the graves in soil that was hard as iron, his hands blistered and bleeding. He had not cried. He had not prayed. He had simply filled the holes and placed the crosses and walked back down the hill. Since then, he had lived alone. He worked the ranch, tended the animals, rode the fence lines. He did not go to town unless he had to. He did not speak to his neighbors. He kept the fire low and the coffee cold and the silence unbroken. It was easier that way. But now there was a woman breathing in the darkness, and the cabin did not feel quite so empty. Tobias turned over and closed his eyes. Sleep came eventually, uneasy and thin. 3 days passed. Nalin's fever broke on the second night, and by the morning of the 4th day she was sitting up, eating solid food, asking for water and books, and anything to break the monotony. Tobias gave her what he had. Not much. A worn copy of Ivanhoe, a farmer's almanac from 1880, a Bible he had not opened since the war. She read them all front to back, her lips moving silently over the English words. "You read well," Tobias said one evening as he stirred beans over the fire. "Mission school," Nalin replied without looking up. "The priests wanted to save our souls. They taught us to read and write and speak like white men. Then the soldiers came and killed half of us anyway." Tobias said nothing. There was nothing to say. On the 5th day, a rider came. Tobias saw him from the window, a single horseman approaching from the south at a steady trot. Military bearing, straight-backed in the saddle. He wore the blue coat of the cavalry and carried a rifle across his pommel. Tobias felt his stomach tighten. "Get in the back room," he told Nalin. "Do not make a sound." She moved quickly, limping but steady, and disappeared behind the heavy curtain that divided the cabin. Tobias checked the Colt at his hip, then stepped outside to meet the rider. The man reined up 10 feet from the porch. He was young, maybe 30, with a sun-scorched face and pale eyes, a corporal's stripes on his sleeve. "Afternoon," the soldier said. "Afternoon. You would be Tobias McCrae. I would." The corporal dismounted and pulled a folded paper from his saddlebag. He handed it over without ceremony. "Letter from Colonel Mason at Fort Bowie. He asked me to deliver it personal." Tobias unfolded the paper and read. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, the ink smudged in places. "McCrae, word has reached us of Apache activity in your area. 2 bounty hunters found dead 3 days past. We believe a renegade woman is responsible. She is wanted for questioning. Bounty stands at $50 alive or dead. Be advised that Virgil Crane has been hired to track her. Crane is dangerous and does not respect territorial law. If you see anything, report to Fort Bowie immediately. Do not engage. Colonel T. Mason." Tobias folded the letter and slipped it into his coat pocket. His face showed nothing. "Seen anything?" the corporal asked. "Nothing. I keep to myself out here." The corporal nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the ranch, the barn, the corral, looking for signs. Tobias kept his breathing steady. "Crane is a hard man," the corporal said quietly. "Used to hunt runaway slaves before the war. Now he hunts whatever pays. If you see the woman, do not try to help her. Crane will kill anyone who gets in his way. Army or civilian does not matter to him. Understood." The corporal mounted up and touched the brim of his hat. "Stay safe, McCrae." "You too, Corporal." Tobias watched him ride away until he was just a speck against the white horizon. Then he went back inside. Nayland was standing in the center of the room, her face ashen. "Virgil Crane," she whispered. "You know him." "Everyone knows him. He killed my cousin 2 years ago, cut off her scalp while she was still alive." Tobias felt something cold settle in his gut. "How many men does he run with?" 12, maybe more. "And they are coming here." "Yes." Tobias walked to the window and looked out at the empty land. The snow had stopped and the sky was clear and brutal blue, beautiful and indifferent. He thought about the letter in his pocket. He thought about the $50 bounty. He thought about how easy it would be to hand Nayland over and collect the money and go back to his quiet life. But when he turned around, he found himself saying something else entirely. "Then we will be ready for them." Nayland stared at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for deception or madness or whatever impulse drove a man to make such a reckless promise. "You do not owe me this," she said finally. "I know. I am nothing to you. I know that too." "Then why?" Tobias crossed to the shelf above the fireplace and took down the photograph. He had not touched it in 7 years, and the glass was thick with dust. He wiped it clean with his sleeve and stood there looking at the two faces frozen in silver and shadow. "Her name was Sarah," he said quietly. "My wife. The girl is Emma. She would have been 10 years old this spring." Nayland moved closer, limping but steady on her healing leg. She looked at the photograph without speaking. "Fever took them both," Tobias continued. "Summer of '76. I rode 3 days to Tucson looking for a doctor. By the time I got back, they were already gone. I buried them on the hill." He set the photograph back on the shelf and turned to face her. "For 7 years I have been living like a dead man. Working the ranch, riding the fence lines, watching the seasons turn. I stopped lighting the fire, stopped cooking hot meals, stopped looking at that photograph. I told myself it was easier that way, that if I did not feel anything, then nothing could hurt me." His voice was steady, but something in it had cracked open. "Then I found you bleeding in that cave, and I thought about Emma, about how she would have looked at me if I had walked away and left you there, about what Sarah would have said." He met Nayland's eyes. "I do not know if helping you makes any kind of sense. Probably it does not. But it is the first choice I have made in 7 years that feels like I am still alive. So I am going to see it through, even if Virgil Crane and his 12 men ride up here tomorrow." Nayland was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was soft. "Your wife and daughter would be proud of you." "Maybe. Or maybe they would tell me I am a fool. Both can be true." Tobias almost smiled. Almost. He moved to the table and began making an inventory. He kept his voice matter-of-fact, clinical, the way he had learned in the cavalry when fear tried to take root. "I have a Winchester 73, he said. 44-40 caliber, 15-round magazine. I have 60 cartridges for it. I have a Colt single-action Army, 45 caliber, 30 rounds. I have a 12-gauge shotgun with 24 shells. That is all." Nayland frowned. "That is not enough." "No, it is not. Not if they come at us all at once." "Then we leave. Ride south, cross into Mexico." Tobias shook his head. "They will hunt you down within a week. Crane knows this country better than we do, and he has a dozen men to cover ground. Our only advantage is that he does not know you are here yet. If we run, we lose that. Then what do? We make this place a fortress. We prepare. And when they come, we make them pay so dearly for every inch that they decide it is not worth the $50. Nalin looked around the cabin. It was solid built from thick logs chinked with mud and moss. The windows were narrow, the door heavy oak reinforced with iron. It had been designed to withstand winter storms and the occasional raid. It was not a fort, but it was close. "How long do we have?" she asked. 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather turns bad again. Then we should start now." They worked through the rest of that day and into the next. Tobias showed Nalin how to load the Winchester, how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe and squeeze instead of jerking the trigger. She learned fast, her hands sure and steady despite the weeks of hunger and cold. By the second afternoon she was hitting targets at 100 yards. 8 out of 10, better than most cavalry troopers Tobias had served with. "Where did you learn to shoot?" he asked. "I did not, but I learned the bow when I was 5 years old. The principle is the same. Aim, breathe, release." They practiced until the light failed, and Tobias's shoulder ached from the recoil. Then they went inside and ate a quiet supper of beans and cornbread, and Nalin asked him about the war. He did not want to talk about it. He never did. But something about the way she asked direct and, without judgment, made the words come easier than they had in years. "I enlisted in '61, he said, 4th Cavalry out of Ohio. I was 19 years old and stupid enough to think it would be over by Christmas. It was not. No, it lasted 4 years. I fought at Chickamauga, Chattanooga, Atlanta, saw more men die than I can count, some from bullets, some from disease, some from just giving up." He stared into his coffee cup, watching the surface ripple. "At Chickamauga I took shrapnel in the shoulder. Field surgeon said I would lose the arm, but I did not. Spent 6 months in a hospital tent, then they put me back in the saddle. By then I had stopped caring whether I lived or died. I just did what I was told and tried not to think too much. And after the war, I came west, met Sarah in Kansas. She was a school teacher, serious and smart and stubborn as a mule. We got married in '67. Emma came a year later." He fell silent, and Nalin did not press him. They sat together in the firelight, 2 people with ghosts they could not bury, and for a little while the silence was almost peaceful. The next day they fortified the cabin. Tobias cut gun ports in the wall's narrow slits just wide enough for a rifle barrel. He stacked bags of grain and flour against the inside walls for extra protection. He checked every board, every nail, every hinge. Nalin worked beside him, hauling water-moving supplies, never complaining even though her leg was still healing. Tobias watched her out of the corner of his eye and felt something shift in his chest. Respect, maybe, or something close to it. On the 3rd evening, as the sun dropped below the western ridge and painted the snow the color of blood, they stood on the porch together and looked out at the empty land. "They will come tomorrow," Nalin said. "Probably." "Are you afraid?" Tobias considered the question honestly. He felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the quickening of his pulse, the cold clarity that came before combat. But it was not fear, not exactly. It was something older and deeper, something he had learned to live with a long time ago. "I stopped being afraid the day I buried my family," he said. "Fear is for people who still have something to lose." Nalin looked at him sidelong. "That is a sad way to live." "It is the only way I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your wife, Sarah, what would she tell you if she were here right now?" Tobias closed his eyes. He could almost hear Sarah's voice, dry and gentle and relentless in its honesty. "She would tell me I am being a fool, that I should let you go and save myself the trouble. And would you listen?" "No." "Why not?" He opened his eyes and looked at Nalin, really looked at her, the fierce set of her jaw, the way she held herself upright despite the pain, the way her eyes met his without flinching. "Because some choices are not about sense. They are about who you want to be when the choosing is done." Nalin nodded slowly. "My people have a saying, loss does not mean choosing stops." "Is that what you believe?" "I do not know, but I think your wife would have liked it." Tobias felt something break open inside him, something that had been locked tight for 7 years. It hurt like fire and ice and the first breath after drowning. "Yes," he said quietly, "I think she would have." They stood together as the darkness came down, two broken people preparing to make a stand that neither of them expected to survive. The wind picked up cold and sharp, carrying the smell of snow and distance and the inevitability of what was coming. And somewhere to the south, Virgil Crane and his 12 men were riding north through the gathering dusk, their breath steaming in the frozen air, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the stone. Dawn came pale and cold, the kind of morning where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Tobias had been awake for hours, sitting at the window with the Winchester across his knees, watching the approaches to the ranch. The world beyond the glass was still and white, untouched by anything living. Nayland stirred behind him, rising from the cot with careful movements that favored her healing leg. She came to stand beside him without speaking, her eyes scanning the same empty horizon. "Nothing yet," Tobias said. "They will come." "Yes." They ate a cold breakfast of jerky and hardtack chewing in silence. Tobias had learned long ago that there was no point in hot meals before a fight. A man's stomach knew what was coming, even when his mind tried to pretend otherwise. The morning stretched out each minute, feeling like an hour. Tobias kept himself busy with small tasks, anything to keep his hands occupied, and his mind from wandering into dark places. He checked the Winchester again, though he had checked it twice already. Worked the lever action to make sure it moved smooth. Counted the cartridges one more time, even though the number had not changed. 60 rounds of 44-40. Nayland watched him from across the room, her expression unreadable. "You are nervous," she said. "I am careful. There is a difference." "Is there?" Tobias set the rifle down and looked at her properly. In the gray morning light, she seemed almost translucent, like something that might fade away if he looked too hard, but her eyes were solid and present, holding his gaze without flinching. "In the war," he said, "I saw men who were not nervous before a fight. They were usually the first ones to die. Fear keeps you alert, keeps you thinking. The moment you stop being afraid is the moment you make a mistake." "Are you afraid now?" He considered lying, then decided against it. "Yes." "Good," Nayland said. "So am I." By mid-morning, the sun had burned through the clouds, turning the snow into a field of diamonds that hurt to look at. Tobias moved through the cabin one more time, checking everything with the methodical thoroughness that had kept him alive through 4 years of war. The ammunition was sorted by type and placed within easy reach of each firing position. Winchester cartridges in a leather pouch near the east gun port. Colt rounds in his coat pocket. Shotgun shells lined up on the windowsill like soldiers at attention. Water buckets stood filled and ready, one by each window. Not for drinking, but for fighting fires. A burning cabin was a death trap, and Tobias had no illusions about the kind of tactics Crane might employ. Blankets were rolled tight and placed beside each gun port, padding that would let them fire for hours without their shoulders being beaten to pulp by recoil. The door was barred with a heavy oak beam that dropped into iron brackets on either side of the frame. It would take a battering ram to break through, and even then, it would not be quick. Nayland had been watching him work, and now she picked up the Winchester and examined it with the same careful attention he had shown. She worked the lever action smooth and practiced now after days of training. The metallic click-clack was loud in the quiet cabin, a sound that spoke of readiness and lethal intent. "Show me again," she said, "how to clear a jam." Tobias moved beside her and guided her hands through the process. Press the lever release. Work the action hard, not gentle. If a cartridge was stuck, you did not coax it out. You forced it. "In a fight," he said, "you will not have time to think about it. Your hands need to know the work by themselves." She nodded and practiced the motion 3 more times, each one smoother than the last. Her fingers were long and strong, calloused from years of hard living. Good hands for this kind of work, You learn fast, Tobias said. I had good teachers. My people have been fighting for survival longer than yours have been on this land. There was no bitterness in her voice when she said it, just a statement of fact. Tobias did not argue. Some truths were too big to debate. He moved to the window and looked out across the empty valley. The morning was beautiful in the way that only winter mornings could be, all crystalline light and sharp shadows. The kind of beauty that made you forget for just a moment that the world was full of men who would kill you for $50. Then he saw the rider. A single horseman coming up the valley from the south at an easy pace. Tall man on a tall horse, both of them moving with the kind of casual confidence that came from never having been seriously challenged. Tobias felt his pulse kick up, not with panic, but with the old familiar clarity that came before a combat. His breathing slowed, his vision sharpened. The cabin around him seemed to fade away until there was nothing but the approaching rider and the rifle in his hands. "Get ready," he said quietly. Nalin moved to the gun port on the opposite wall without a word. She had seen him too. As the rider drew closer, details emerged. A long coat the color of Confederate gray, despite the war having been over for 18 years. A black hat pulled low over silver hair. A face that was handsome in a hard-weathered way, with sharp cheekbones and a jaw like carved granite, and running from his left temple down to his jawline a scar that looked like melted wax. Old burn damage, the kind that never quite healed right. "Virgil Crane," Nayland breathed. Tobias said nothing. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, not pulling, but ready. At this distance, maybe 60 yards, he could drop Crane with one shot. The thought was tempting, almost overwhelming in its simplicity. One pull, one dead man, problem solved. But killing a man in cold blood, even a man like Virgil Crane, was a line Tobias had not crossed since the war. He was not sure he wanted to cross it again. Not yet. Not unless there was no other choice. Crane rode to within 50 yards of the cabin and stopped. He sat his horse like a man posing for a portrait, straight-backed, and still, his hands visible and empty of weapons. Then he raised one hand, palm out, in a gesture that might have been greeting or mockery. "Tobias McCrae," he called out. His voice carried easily in the cold air, smooth and cultured, touched with the soft vowels of Georgia. "I wonder if I might have a word." Tobias did not move from his position at the gun port. "You can talk from there." Crane smiled. Even from this distance, Tobias could see the flash of white teeth against tanned skin. "I could. But it seems inhospitable me out here in the cold while you are warm inside. The war is over, Sergeant. We are both veterans. That ought to buy me at least the courtesy of a conversation. State your business, Crane." "Very well." Crane shifted slightly in his saddle, settling in as if he had all the time in the world. "I am looking for an Apache woman. Young, early 20s, black hair about this tall." He held his hand at roughly shoulder height. "She killed 2 of my men 3 days past. Good men, both of them. I have been hired to bring her in, and I intend to see it done. $50 dead or alive. I do not suppose you have seen her. No." The lie came easy, smooth as oil. Tobias kept his face neutral, his voice flat and empty of emotion. But even as the word left his mouth, he knew Crane did not believe it. Crane tilted his head, studying the cabin with the careful attention of a man who made his living noticing things other people missed. His eyes moved over the windows, the door, the small details that might betray the truth. "Curious," he said after a moment. "I could have sworn I saw smoke from 2 chimneys yesterday evening when I rode past. And those clothes on the line behind your barn, unless I am mistaken, they look a mite small for a man of your size." Tobias said nothing. His finger tightened fractionally on the trigger. Tobias kept the rifle steady on Crane's chest. At this range he could not miss. One pull of the trigger and the problem would be solved, at least temporarily. But the other 12 men would still come, and they would come angry, and there would be no talking then. Only blood. 3 days, Crane repeated. "Use them wisely, Sergeant. Think about what you are willing to die for. Think about whether this Apache girl is worth your life. Because I promise you, if you stand between me and $50, I will go through you without a second thought." Still, Tobias said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the best answer, that letting the other man talk himself out was better than rising to the bait. Crane waited for a response that did not come. After a long minute, he laughed a sound without humor. "Stubborn. I can respect that. Very well, Sergeant, we will do this the hard way." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was almost respectful, then turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. Not hurrying, not looking back, just that same unhurried pace that said he was a man who knew he held all the cards and was content to let his opponent sweat. Tobias watched until Crane was out of sight, then lowered the rifle and exhaled slowly. His hands were steady, rock solid, but his heart was hammering against his ribs like it wanted to break free. Nalin stepped up beside him. Her face was pale but composed, her jaw set in that stubborn line he was coming to recognize. "You should have shot him," she said. "Probably. Why did you not—" That night, after Nalin had gone to sleep, Tobias walked up the hill to the two graves. He had not been up here since the day he buried them. 7 years of avoiding this place, of pretending it did not exist. Now he knelt in the snow between the crosses and spoke to Sarah and Emma, for the first time since he had lowered them into the ground. "I met someone," he said quietly to the silent earth. "Her name is Nalin. She is Apache. She is in trouble, and men are coming to kill us both. I do not know if we will survive. Probably we will not." The wind sighed through the pines, carrying his words away. "But I am choosing to fight, because I finally understand something. Loss does not mean choosing stops. It means the choices I make matter more because I know what it costs to make them." He touched each cross, brushing away the snow and ice. "I hope that is all right. I hope you would understand." He stood and walked back down the hill. Nalin was standing in the cabin doorway, silhouetted by firelight. "You went to see them," she said. "Yes." "What did you tell them? That I am trying to be the man they thought I was. Before the war, before I gave up." She nodded slowly. "They would be proud of you." "Maybe," Tobias said. "Or maybe they would tell me I am a fool. Both can be true." He almost smiled. Yes, both can be true. They went inside together and Tobias closed the door against the cold. Tobias set the Winchester against the wall and rubbed his face with both hands. He felt suddenly overwhelmingly tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much weight for too long. Because once you start shooting men like that in cold blood, you do not stop. You become them. You become the kind of man who kills for money and calls it justice. He is going to come back and kill us both. I know. Then what is the point of mercy? Tobias looked at her, really looked at her. She was so young, he realized. 23 years old, and already she spoke of killing and being killed like they were the only options the world offered. Maybe for her they were. Maybe that was all her life had ever taught her. But he thought about Sarah again and Emma and the way they had looked at him when he came home from the war. Like he was still human underneath all the blood and violence. Like there was still something in him worth saving, worth coming home to. The point, he said quietly, is that it is the only thing that separates us from animals. The moment we stop trying to be better than our worst impulses is the moment we lose everything that matters. Nalin shook her head slowly, but she did not argue. Maybe she understood. Maybe she just knew there was no point in debating philosophy when death was riding toward them with 12 guns and a heart full of cold purpose. They spent the rest of that day in preparation, and this time Tobias held nothing back. He showed Nalin everything he knew, all the hard lessons purchased with blood in places like Chickamauga and Chattanooga and Atlanta. He started with the weapons, spreading them out on the table like a surgeon laying out instruments. The Winchester Model 1873 chambered in .44-40, 15-round tubular magazine, effective range about 200 yards in the right hands. He showed her how to disassemble it, how to clean the action, how to spot the warning signs of a weapon about to fail. Oil here on the bolt. Check the firing pin for cracks. Work the lever until it moved like water, smooth and inevitable. The Colt Single-Action Army, 45 caliber, 6 rounds in the cylinder. You only loaded 5 and kept the hammer on an empty chamber because a dropped gun with 6 rounds would fire and probably kill someone you did not intend to kill. Range may be 50 yards for a decent shot less if you were panicking. He showed her the grip, the stance, the way you cocked the hammer with your thumb while you were bringing the gun up to aim not after, because every fraction of a second mattered. The 12-gauge shotgun double-barreled break action. 2 shots, then reload. Devastating at close range, useless past 20 yards. The spread pattern meant you did not have to aim as carefully, but it also meant you could not be surgical about your targets. This was a weapon for when things went wrong and men were too close and you just needed them to stop coming forward. Nayland absorbed it all with the focused intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was survival. Her hands learned the work quickly, muscle memory building with each repetition. Again, Tobias would say, and she would break down the Winchester and reassemble it, her fingers moving faster each time. Again, and she would dry-fire the Colt, perfecting the smooth motion of cocking and aiming in one fluid movement. Again, and she would practice loading the shotgun shells, fumbling at first, then getting faster, until she could reload in the time it took to draw 3 breaths. By late afternoon, they moved on to ammunition management, and this was where Tobias got specific in a way that made the whole situation real. 60 rounds for the Winchester, he said, counting them out into neat rows on the table. 30 for the Colt. 24 shotgun shells. That is all we have. No more. When these are gone, we are done. He let that sink in, watching her do the mathematics in her head. 13 men, counting Crane. If they were very good and very lucky, maybe 1 or 2 bullets per man. But luck was not something you could count on, and fear made even good shooters miss. Not enough, Nayland said. No, not for a siege. Not if they come at us all at once and push hard. But it is enough to make them pay so dearly for every inch that they might decide it is not worth the $50. And if they do not decide that, then we die. But we die on our feet, fighting, not on our knees, begging for mercy that will not come. He said it matter-of-factly, without drama, because that was the only way to say such things. You looked at the truth straight on and did not blink. They spent another hour working on tactics, and here Tobias drew on everything the cavalry had taught him about defensive positions. He sketched diagrams in the dirt of the cabin floor with a stick, showing her fields of fire, dead zones, the mathematics of angles and distance. They will probe first, he said. Send a few men to test our response. See how many guns we have, how good we shoot, whether we have the stomach for blood. When they know what they are facing, then they will commit. How long do we have? 3 days, maybe 4. Crane was not lying about that. He wants us to think about what is coming, wants us to break ourselves worrying about it. That is part of his strategy. Will it work? Tobias smiled without humor. It already is. As twilight fell, they moved on to preparing the cabin itself for siege. Tobias had done this before in a dozen burning barns and ruined farmhouses across Georgia and Tennessee, turning civilian structures into fortresses that had to be paid for with blood. They moved the heavy table against the door, adding mass and stability to the oak beam already in place. They filled every container they had with water and placed them strategically around the cabin. They cut additional gun ports in the walls, narrow slits positioned to cover the approaches from every direction. Nayland worked beside him without complaint, hauling and lifting and hammering her injured leg, holding up better than he had expected. She was strong, he realized, not in the way men measured strength by how much weight you could lift or how far you could ride without stopping, but in the deeper way, the way that mattered when the world was trying to break you and you refused to bend. By full dark, they had done everything they could. The cabin was as ready as it would ever be. Now there was nothing left but waiting. They ate cold supper sitting on the floor with their backs against the wall, too tired for conversation. The fire had burned down to coals that glowed faintly in the darkness. Outside, the wind had picked up, sighing through the eaves like something in pain. Tobias found himself staring at the empty shelf where the photograph had stood. He could still see the shapes in his mind, Sarah and Emma, frozen in that moment of artificial stillness the camera required. But the actual image was gone, burned or broken or lost, and somehow that made it easier to remember them as they had really been. Moving, breathing, alive. "Tell me about your daughter," Nalin said suddenly, breaking the long silence. Tobias looked over at her. She was sitting with her knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them, her face half hidden in shadow. "Why?" he asked. "Because if we die in 3 days, I want to know what you are fighting for. I want to understand why you would throw your life away for someone you barely know." He almost refused. The words were right there, ready to deflect, to change the subject, to retreat back into the safe silence he had maintained for 7 years. But then he thought about Emma's face, really let himself remember it, and the words came anyway. "She had brown eyes," he said quietly, "like her mother, and she laughed at everything, even when there was nothing funny to laugh about. She would chase chickens around the yard and make up songs about them. Terrible songs, no rhythm, no sense to them at all, but she sang them like they were hymns in church." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he stopped to take a breath and steady himself. "She was afraid of thunder. Every storm that rolled through, she would climb into bed with us and hide under the covers between me and Sarah. And Sarah would tell her stories until the thunder passed. Stories about brave girls who were not afraid of anything, who fought dragons and saved kingdoms." He stared into the dying coals, seeing shapes there that were not really there. "The day she died, I was not here. I was riding hard for Tucson, thinking I could bring back a doctor in time to save them. But the doctor was away on another call tending to some rancher's wife who had broken her leg. By the time I made it back to Red Willow, both of them were already gone. Sarah had wrapped Emma in her favorite blanket, the one with the blue flowers, and laid her out in the bedroom. She looked like she was sleeping, just sleeping." His hands were trembling now, and he pressed them flat against his thighs to make them stop. "I buried them myself. Dug the graves in ground that was hard as iron, my hands bleeding through the blisters. It took me most of a day, and when I was done I put up the crosses and walked back down that hill, and I swore I would never care about anything or anyone ever again. Because caring was what killed you. Caring was the knife that opened you up and let all the life run out." Nalin was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the space between them and put her hand on his. It was the first time she had touched him since that moment in the cave, and her skin was warm against his. "I am sorry," she said. "So am I." They sat like that in the darkness, two people bound together by grief and circumstance, and the strange alchemy that happened when you shared the certainty of your own death with another human being. "My mother died when I was 8, Nalin said after a while. "Smallpox, the white man's disease. It swept through our village and killed half the children and most of the old people. We burned the bodies and everything they had touched, but it did not matter. Death had already moved in and made itself at home." She stared at the coals, her voice flat and empty. "My father blamed me, said I carried bad medicine. He gave me to my uncle to raise, but my uncle's wife hated me. She beat me when no one was looking. Used a willow switch on my back until I bled. The scars you saw, those are from her." "Why did she hate you?" "Because I was alive and her own daughter was dead. Because grief makes people cruel. Because the world is full of pain and someone has to carry it, and I was convenient." Tobias understood that in a way he wished he did not. The need to blame someone, anyone, when the universe refused to make sense. The way suffering looked for a target and usually found the nearest innocent. "When I was 15, Nalin continued, my uncle tried to marry me off to a man twice my age, a warrior who already had 2 wives and wanted a third. I refused. ran away into the desert with nothing but a knife and a water skin. The mission priests found me 3 days later, nearly dead from thirst. They took me and taught me English, taught me to read. For 2 years, I thought I had found a place where I could be safe. What happened? Soldiers came. They said the mission was harboring renegades, helping them hide from the army. They burned it, killed 3 of the priests. The others ran. I went back to my people, but I was not Apache anymore. I spoke too much English, thought too much like a white woman. I did not belong anywhere. She pulled her hand back and wrapped her arms around herself again as if trying to hold something in. The man my uncle wanted me to marry, he still wanted me. He came to my shelter one night and tried to take what he thought was his. I cut him, not deep enough to kill, but deep enough that he would remember. The council exiled me, said I brought nothing but trouble and bad fortune. So I left. And then the bounty hunters came. The 2 men in the snow. Yes, they tracked me for 2 weeks. I killed them both, but not before one of them put that gash in my leg. I thought I would die out there, thought maybe that would be better than living. Then you found me. The silence settled over them again, heavier now, weighted with the accumulated sorrow of 2 lives that had seen too much and lost too much and somehow kept going anyway. Finally, Tobias spoke, his voice rough. There is an Apache saying. I heard it once years ago from a scout who rode with us during the war. He said it in English so we would understand. Loss does not mean choosing stops. It means the choices we make matter more because we know what it costs to make them. Nalin looked at him, her eyes bright in the faint glow from the coals. Do you believe that? I did not. Not for a long time. But maybe I am starting to. She nodded slowly, and something passed between them in that moment, some wordless understanding that went deeper than language or culture or all the things that divided them. They were 2 people who had been broken by the world and had somehow survived their breaking. And now they were going to stand together against 12 men and a universe that did not care whether they lived or died. It was not much, but it was enough. Tobias stood and walked to the window, looking out into the darkness. Somewhere out there, Virgil Crane was waiting, planning, preparing to come back and finish what he had started. We should rest while we can, he said. Tomorrow, we start preparing in earnest. Nalin rose and moved to the cot. She lay down fully clothed, the Winchester within easy reach, and pulled a blanket over herself. Tobias, she said. Yes, thank you for telling me about your daughter. Thank you for listening. He took up his position by the window, the Colt heavy on his hip, and settled in for a long night of watching and waiting. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, indifferent to the small dramas of men and women preparing to die for reasons that probably made no sense to anyone but themselves. But that was all right. Tobias had stopped needing the universe to make sense a long time ago. He just needed to make it through the next 3 days. Everything else could wait. The next morning broke clear and cold, the sun rising like a copper coin into a sky that was hard and blue and pitiless. Tobias had not slept, not really, just drifted in and out of that shallow state of awareness where you were never quite unconscious but never quite alert either. His shoulder ached from the old shrapnel wound, the joint stiff and grinding in the cold. He worked it carefully, rotating the arm until the pain dulled to something manageable. The body was a machine, he had learned, and like any machine, it needed maintenance to keep functioning. Nalin was already awake, heating water over the rebuilt fire. She had made coffee strong and bitter, and they drank it standing at the window, while the world outside slowly came into focus through the frost on the glass. 2 more days, she said. 2 more days. They spent the morning on final preparations, the kind of detailed work that might mean the difference between life and death when bullets started flying. Tobias showed Nalin how to build a proper barricade using the furniture and bags of grain, positioning everything to provide maximum cover while still allowing clear fields of fire. They practiced reloading under stress, forcing themselves to work faster to overcome the fumbling panic that happened when your hands were shaking and your heart was trying to pound out of your chest. Nalin dropped cartridges twice cursed in Apache, then got faster, her fingers learning the movements until they became automatic. "In a fight," Tobias said, "you will not think. You cannot think. Thinking is too slow. Your body has to know the work by itself." They ran through scenarios, talking through what they would do if the attack came from different directions, if they ran out of ammunition, if one of them was wounded. It was grim work planning for failure and death. But Tobias had learned in the war that optimism got you killed. Better to think through the worst possibilities and have a plan, even a bad plan, than to be caught by surprise. By afternoon they moved on to something Tobias had been thinking about since Crane's visit. The cabin was defensible, but it was also a trap. Once they were inside and surrounded, they had nowhere to go. If Crane was smart, and Tobias suspected he would simply pin them down and wait them out. No food, no water, except what they had stored, no way to escape. "We need another option," Tobias said. "A way out if things go wrong." "What do you suggest?" "We make them think we are running, leave tracks heading north toward the high country, lead them into ground where their numbers mean nothing." "An ambush." "Yes. There is a canyon about 2 miles north of here, Broken Spine, they call it. Narrow at both ends, wider in the middle. If we could draw them in there, we might have a chance." Nalin considered this, her eyes distant. "In my village, when we were outnumbered, we did not fight in the open. We used the land, made the enemy come to us on ground we chose where their horses could not go, and their numbers worked against them." "Exactly. How many entrances to this canyon?" "2, north and south. The walls are too steep to climb, maybe 50 feet of sheer rock. And if we blocked one entrance, then they would have to come through the other, single file." She nodded slowly. "That is good ground for killing. It is also good ground to die on if we make a mistake." "Do we have a better idea?" Tobias thought about it, running through other options in his mind. Every scenario he could imagine ended the same way, 2 people against 13. The mathematics were brutal and unyielding. Their only advantage was choosing the ground, making Crane and his men come to them in a place where numbers meant less. "No," he admitted, "we do not." They spent the rest of the afternoon moving supplies to a cache point halfway between the ranch and the canyon. Blankets, food, extra ammunition, everything they would need to survive a few days in the cold if the cabin fell. It was hard work hauling the supplies through snow that was sometimes knee-deep, and by the time they were done, both of them were sweating despite the temperature. Tobias's shoulder was screaming by the end, the old injury protesting the abuse. He did not complain. Complaining changed nothing. As twilight came down, they made one final trip to the cache, and then continued north to scout the canyon itself. Tobias wanted to see it with fresh eyes, to think through the angles, and the sight lines, and all the small details that would matter when men were dying. The canyon was just as he remembered it. A gash in the earth, maybe a quarter-mile long, the walls rising steep and red on either side. The floor was scattered with rocks and dead trees offering cover, but also obstacles. The north entrance was narrower than the south, maybe 15 feet wide, and there was a tumble of boulders that could be used to create a choke point. Tobias stood at the south entrance and looked back the way they had come. From here you could see the ranch in the distance, a dark smudge against the snow. Smoke would have been rising from the chimney if they had lit the fire, a beacon visible for miles. "This is where we make our stand," he said. Nalin was walking the floor of the canyon, studying the terrain with the practiced eye of someone who had spent her life reading land. She pointed to a shelf of rock about 20 feet up the east wall. "There. I could shoot from there, cover the south entrance. Anyone coming through would have to pass directly below me. And if they spot you, then I move. There are paths up the rock face hidden from below. My people use this canyon for hunting. I know the ways." Tobias felt something loosen in his chest. He had been planning to use the canyon, but he had not expected it to be familiar ground for her. That changed things. changed them considerably. "All right," he said. "We set it up like this. We let them take the ranch, make it look like we ran, leave obvious tracks heading north. When they follow, we are already in position here. You take the high ground on the east side. I will be at the north entrance with the Winchester. When they are deep in the canyon, we hit them from both directions. And if they do not all come in, if some stay back, then we kill the ones who do come in and worry about the rest later." It was not a perfect plan. Plans never were. But it was the best they had, and sometimes the best you had was just barely good enough to keep you breathing. They walked back to the ranch in the gathering darkness, neither of them speaking. The weight of what was coming pressed down like a physical thing, making each step harder than the last. That night Tobias did something he had not done in 7 years. He walked up the hill to the 2 graves and stood there in the moonlight, looking down at the wooden crosses that marked where Sarah and Emma lay. The crosses were weathered now, the wood gray and splitting. He should have replaced them, should have carved the names deeper so they would not fade, but he had not been able to make himself come up here, had not been able to face what those graves represented. Now he knelt in the snow and brushed away the ice that had formed on the markers. "I am sorry," he said quietly, speaking to the darkness and the silence and the 2 people who could not hear him any more. "I am sorry I was not here. I am sorry I could not save you. I am sorry I spent 7 years being too much of a coward to even look at your graves." The wind sighed through the pines, carrying away his words. "I met someone," he continued. "Her name is Nayland. She is Apache. She is in trouble, and I am trying to help her. Men are coming to kill us both, and I do not know if we will survive. Probably we will not. But I wanted you to know that I am trying. I am trying to be the man you thought I was before the war took him away." He fell silent, his throat tight. After a moment he heard footsteps in the snow behind him. Nayland had followed him up the hill. She stood a respectful distance away, not intruding, but not leaving either. "They would be proud of you," she said softly. "You do not know that. Yes, I do. Because if I had a husband who fought for a stranger the way you are fighting for me, I would be proud. And if I had a father like that, I would know he loved me even after death." Tobias stood slowly, his knees aching from kneeling in the cold. He looked at Nayland, her face pale in the moonlight, and felt something shift inside him. Not love, not yet, maybe not ever, but something close to it. Connection, purpose, the sense that his life still mattered to someone. "We should go back," he said. "One more day to prepare." They walked down the hill together, and when they reached the cabin, Tobias built up the fire and made coffee, and they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Tomorrow they would finish the preparations, and the day after that, Virgil Crane would come. The 3rd day arrived with a false sense of peace. The sun rose bright and warm unseasonably, so turning the snow to slush and making the whole world glitter like it was covered in glass. It was the kind of day that made you forget just for a moment that death was riding north with 12 guns and a cold heart. Tobias spent the morning making one final check of everything. The weapons were clean and loaded. The ammunition was counted and recounted. The cache was stocked. The tracks they had laid heading north toward the canyon were obvious enough that a blind man could follow them. Now there was nothing left but waiting. They ate lunch in the cabin, a hot meal of beans and cornbread, because Tobias figured they had earned it and there was no point in dying on an empty stomach. Nayland ate with good appetite, scraping her plate clean, and Tobias found himself watching her with something like admiration. She was not afraid, or if she was, she hid it so well that it made no difference. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were clear. She moved with purpose and certainty, like a woman who had already accepted what was coming and made peace with it. "You are staring," she said without looking up. "I am." "Why?" "Because you are braver than anyone I have ever met." Now she did look at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "I am not brave. I am just tired of running." "That is what bravery is," Tobias said. "Being terrified and doing it anyway." They finished eating and cleaned the dishes, and then there was nothing left to do but wait. The afternoon dragged by with agonizing slowness, each minute feeling like an hour. Tobias found himself checking the window every few minutes, scanning the approaches, looking for the dust cloud that would signal riders coming. But the land remained empty. Evening came, and with it, the cold. The temperature dropped fast once the sun went down, and Tobias let the fire burn low so it would not be visible from a distance. They sat in the near-dark weapons within reach, listening to the night sounds. Around midnight, Tobias heard it, the faint jingle of tack, the creak of leather, the soft thud of hooves on packed snow, men moving in the darkness trying to be quiet, but not quite managing it. He moved to the gun port and looked out. At first he saw nothing. Then, like ghosts materializing from shadow, he made out movement in the tree line 200 yards south. 4 shapes, low and careful, moving toward the cabin in a loose skirmish line. 4 men, he whispered. Advance scouts. The rest will be hanging back. Nalin was beside him, now the Winchester in her hands. Do we shoot? Not yet. Let them get closer. Make them think we are asleep. The 4 men reached the corral and paused, conferring in whispers. Tobias could not make out the words, but he could read their body language. Cautious. Professional. These were not amateurs. Then they split up. 2 headed for the barn. 2 came toward the cabin. Tobias moved to the gun port on the east wall and brought the Winchester to his shoulder. He sighted on the nearest man, tracking him as he crossed the open ground. Beside him, he could hear Nalin's breathing, slow and steady. She had the other gun port covered. On my mark, he breathed. You take left. I take right. The 2 men reached the porch. One of them tried the door, found it barred. He looked at his companion and shrugged. Then he raised his boot and kicked hard at the lock. Now, Tobias said. He fired. The Winchester's report was deafening, a thunderclap that shattered the night. The man on the right went down like a puppet with cut strings clutching his chest. He hit the ground and did not move. Nalin's rifle fired a heartbeat later. Her target staggered back, hit somewhere high on the left side. He did not fall, but stumbled off the porch and began running for cover, shouting. From the corral came more shouting. The other 2 scouts had heard the gunfire and were scrambling for their horses. Tobias worked the lever smooth and fast, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh one. He swung the barrel to track the running men and fired twice more. The first shot missed, kicking up snow 3 feet behind the nearest target. The second caught him in the leg. He went down hard, screaming a high, thin sound that carried in the cold air. Then there was return fire, muzzle flashes bright in the darkness, bullets thudding into the cabin walls with solid impacts that shook dust from the rafters. Tobias ducked back from the gun port as splinters exploded from the window frame, stinging his face. "Stay low," he shouted. The gunfire intensified, building to a crescendo. 5 rifles, 6, 7, maybe more. The cabin shook under the assault. Glass shattered somewhere. A bullet punched through the door and buried itself in the far wall with a solid thunk. But the walls held. The thick logs absorbed the punishment, and the narrow gun ports made it almost impossible for the attackers to get a clean shot inside. Tobias counted to 10, forcing himself to breathe steady, then rose and fired 3 more times through the gun port. He did not know if he hit anything, but the incoming fire slackened momentarily as the men outside sought cover. "How many rounds?" he called to Nalin. 4 fired. 11 left in the magazine. "Good. Conserve them. Only shoot when you can hit something." The attack broke off as suddenly as it had begun. The gunfire sputtered and stopped, leaving only ringing silence and the acrid smell of burnt powder hanging in the air. Tobias waited, listening. He could hear men shouting to each other in the darkness, issuing orders, regrouping. The wounded man in the corral was still screaming, though weaker now. Then a voice rose above the others, calm and authoritative. Virgil Crane. "Cease fire! Pull back to the tree line!" Footsteps retreated. The screaming man fell silent, either dead or dragged away. The night settled back into stillness, but it was a tense stillness now, the kind that pressed on your ears like water pressure. Crane's voice came again, closer this time, somewhere just beyond the cabin but still hidden in shadow. "Sergeant McCrae, that was well done. My compliments. You shoot like a man who has done it before, but you cannot hold out forever. We have you surrounded, and we have time. Sooner or later, you will run out of ammunition or water or nerve. Why not make this easy on yourself? Send the woman out, and I give you my word as an officer, you can walk away from this alive." Tobias said nothing. He was busy counting in his head. 4 men approached, 1 dead on the porch, 1 wounded and retreated. 1 wounded in the corral, probably dead by now. 1 escaped clean. That left 10 plus Crane. 11 guns still operational, better than 13, but not by much. "McCrae," Crane called again. "I know you are listening. I know you are thinking about what I said. Think hard, Sergeant. Think about whether this Apache girl is worth your life. Because I promise you, if we have to come in there and dig you out, I will make sure your death is slow." Tobias still did not respond. Words were cheap. Crane was trying to get inside his head, trying to make him doubt. Better to stay silent and let Crane wonder. After a long moment, Crane laughed a sound without humor. "Stubborn fool, very well. We will do this the hard way." More movement in the darkness, orders being given, men spreading out taking new positions, and then a sound that made Tobias's blood run cold. A whoosh and a flicker of orange light. "Fire," Nalin said, her voice tight. A bottle arced through the air, trailing flame like a comet. It shattered against the side of the barn, and instantly the old dry wood caught. Within seconds, the barn was blazing flames climbing 30 feet into the sky, turning night into day. Tobias cursed viciously. The barn had been their backup position, their fallback if the cabin became untenable. Now it was gone. Another bottle flew through the air. This one struck the cabin roof and exploded, spreading liquid fire across the shingles. Tobias could hear it dripping down the inside walls, could smell the sharp chemical stench of kerosene mixed with tar. "We need to move," he said. "Now." "Where?" "Out the back. Head for the cache." He grabbed the satchel of extra ammunition and the bag of supplies they had prepared. Nalin took the Winchester and her pack. Together they moved to the rear door, the one that opened onto the lean-to shed behind the main cabin. Tobias eased the door open an inch and peered out, clear as far as he could see in the firelight. The attackers were concentrated on the south and east sides, probably expecting them to try to break out in that direction. "Go," he said. "Fast and low. Make for those rocks. I will be right behind you." Nalin slipped through the door and ran, her form bent low, moving fast, despite her healing leg. Tobias followed, pulling the door shut behind him. The night exploded with light and sound. The barn was a tower of flame now, and the cabin roof was burning, smoke pouring from every crack. Men were shouting, realizing their quarry was escaping. A rifle cracked. The bullet struck rock 3 feet from Tobias's head and screamed away into darkness. He did not slow down, just kept running, his boots slipping in the slush, his lungs burning. More gunfire, a whole volley this time. Bullets whipped past his head so close he could hear them cutting the air. Something tugged at his coat, and he knew without looking that he had been hit, the bullet passing through fabric without touching flesh. They reached the rocks and threw themselves into cover just as a sustained fusillade tore through the space where they had been standing. Tobias pressed himself flat against cold stone, gasping for air, his heart hammering. Nalin was beside him, unhurt, her eyes wide but clear. "Are you hit?" she asked. "No. You—" "I am fine." Behind them the cabin was fully engulfed now, flames reaching for the sky. 7 years of his life burning, every memory, every ghost reduced to ash and smoke. Tobias watched it burn and felt nothing, or maybe everything. He could not tell any more. "Move," he said. "North, do not stop." They moved through the rocks like hunted animals, using every scrap of cover, pausing only to listen for pursuit. Behind them, the voices were growing fainter, more confused. Crane was trying to organize a chase, but the darkness and the terrain were working against him. By the time they reached the cache hidden in its shallow cave a mile north of the ranch, Tobias was fairly certain they had lost their pursuers. He allowed himself a small fire just enough to warm their hands and brew coffee. They sat in silence, too exhausted for words. The coffee was bitter and scalding hot, and it tasted like life itself. After a long while, Nalin spoke. "Your home is gone." "Yes." "I am sorry." Tobias stared into the small flames. "It stopped being a home the day I buried my family. After that it was just a place, a tomb I was living in. And now it is ashes. Maybe that is better. Maybe that is what it needed to be all along." He thought about the photograph curling and blackening in the fire. Sarah and Emma reduced to carbon and memory. Part of him ached for the loss, but another part felt strangely free, as if a chain he had not known he was wearing had finally broken. "We rest 3 hours," he said. "Then we move to the canyon and set up the ambush. When Crane comes after us, and we will be ready." Nalin nodded and lay down on the blankets, pulling one over herself. Within minutes her breathing had evened into sleep. Tobias watched the Winchester across his knees. He thought about what was coming, the canyon, the killing that would have to be done, the very real possibility that he and Nalin would both be dead before the sun set tomorrow. But he also thought about choices, about how loss did not mean choosing stopped, about how sometimes the only way to honor the dead was to keep living, even when living meant fighting and bleeding and refusing to give up. Sarah would have understood, Emma too in her own way, and maybe that was enough. The fire burned down to coals. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the darkness to the south, Virgil Crane and his men were regrouping, preparing to finish what they had started. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight Tobias McCrae was alive, and he intended to stay that way. Dawn came reluctantly, the sky turning from black to gray, to a pale, washed-out blue that promised nothing. Tobias had not slept, though he had tried. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the cabin burning, heard the screams of the wounded man in the corral, felt the bullet tugging at his coat. He rose stiff and cold, his joints protesting every movement. The fire had died hours ago, and frost had formed on the inside of the cave where their breath had condensed. Winter had teeth, and it was showing them now. Nalin woke when he stirred. She sat up quickly, reaching for the Winchester before her eyes were fully open. Combat reflexes, the kind you did not lose once you had learned them. "Time to move," Tobias said. They ate a cold breakfast of jerky and hardtack, chewing mechanically while they packed up the cache. Everything they did not absolutely need, they left behind. Speed and mobility mattered now more than comfort. The sun was fully up by the time they reached the canyon, though its light did little to warm the frozen land. Broken spines stretched before them like a wound in the earth, the red rock walls rising steep and impassable on either side. Tobias stood at the south entrance and studied the ground with fresh eyes, thinking through the killing that was about to happen here. The floor of the canyon was maybe 40 feet wide at this end, narrowing to perhaps 20 feet at the north entrance. The walls were sheer sandstone, weathered and cracked, rising 50 feet or more before they broke into slopes that could be climbed. Perfect ground for an ambush, terrible ground to be caught in. "Show me the paths," he said to Nalin. She led him along the base of the east wall, pointing out handholds and narrow ledges that were invisible unless you knew where to look. Her people had used this canyon for generations, she explained, for hunting for ceremonies, for ambushing enemies who were foolish enough to follow them into confined spaces. 20 feet up the east wall was a natural shelf, maybe 6 feet deep and 15 feet long, hidden from below by an overhang of rock. From there you could see the entire length of the canyon floor and shoot down into it with impunity. "This is where I will be," Nalin said. Tobias studied the position, calculating angles and distances. How many rounds do you have left? Maybe 40, hard to count after all the fighting. Make everyone count. When they come through that entrance, wait until at least half of them are inside before you start shooting. We want as many as possible committed before they realize it is a trap. And you? I will be at the north entrance with the shotgun and the Colt. Anyone who tries to run will have to come through me. That is suicide if they all come at once. Then I will die well armed. He said it lightly, but they both knew the truth of it. If Crane brought all his remaining men into the canyon at the same time, Tobias would be overwhelmed in minutes. But that was the gamble they were making. That Crane would be cautious, that he would send scouts first, that he would split his forces. If they were wrong, they would die quickly. If they were right, they might survive long enough to matter. Nalin climbed to her position with practiced ease, moving up the rock face like she was born to it. Within moments she had disappeared into shadow invisible from below. Tobias watched her go and felt a strange tightness in his chest that might have been fear or might have been something else. He walked the length of the canyon one more time, memorizing every rock, every dead tree, every piece of cover that might save his life in the chaos to come. Then he moved to the north entrance and began building his fortification. There was a tumble of boulders here, remnants of some ancient rockfall, and he used them to create a low wall that would provide cover while still allowing him to shoot. He positioned the shotgun within easy reach, both barrels loaded with buckshot. The Colt was on his hip, fully loaded now, 6 rounds instead of the usual 5, because he did not plan on dropping it. When he was satisfied with the position, he settled in to wait. The sun climbed higher, warming the rock, but not the air. Tobias's breath plumed white every time he exhaled. His shoulder ached where the old shrapnel had lodged itself 2 decades ago, a dull throb that never quite went away. He rotated the joint carefully, keeping it loose. Time moved strangely when you were waiting to kill or be killed. Minutes stretched like hours, and yet, when he looked up, the sun had barely moved at all. Around midday he heard them coming, the sound carried in the clear air unmistakable. Horses moving at a walk, many of them, men talking in low voices, the jingle of tack and the creak of leather, and all the small noises that an armed group made when they thought they were being careful but were not quite careful enough. Tobias pressed himself flat against the rocks and waited. He could see the south entrance from here, a rectangle of bright light framing the world beyond. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a single rider appeared silhouetted against the sky. The rider sat motionless for perhaps 30 seconds, studying the canyon. Even from this distance, Tobias recognized the posture, the bearing. Virgil Crane. Crane raised one hand in a signal, and more men appeared behind him. Tobias counted quickly. 8 riders. Maybe 9, hard to tell with them bunched up like that. Not all of them then. Crane had left some behind, probably to watch the approaches to make sure this was not a counter-ambush. Smart, careful, exactly what Tobias would have done. The riders moved into the canyon in single file, their horses picking careful paths through the rocks and debris on the floor. They were alert, weapons-drawn eyes scanning the walls above. They knew this was dangerous ground. They just did not know how dangerous yet. Tobias waited. He could feel his heart beating slow and steady, the old combat calm settling over him like a familiar coat. His breathing evened out. His hands stopped trembling. This was the easy part. The waiting was agony, but the doing was almost simple. The riders were halfway into the canyon, now spread out in a loose line. Crane was in the lead, riding that tall horse with the same casual confidence he had shown at the ranch. Behind him came his men, rough-looking types with hard faces and harder eyes. Tobias waited. 3/4 of the way in now. Crane was calling a halt, raising his hand. The riders stopped, and Crane stood in his stirrups to look around. He was suspicious, wary, his instincts telling him something was wrong, even if he could not put his finger on what. Tobias waited. Then Crane made his decision. He gestured forward, and the riders began moving again, heading toward the north entrance where Tobias was hidden. Tobias let them get within 30 yards. Then he looked up at the shelf where Nalin was concealed and gave a low whistle barely louder than the wind. The Winchester cracked sharp and clean. The last rider in the line jerked backward in his saddle as if struck by an invisible fist. He toppled sideways and hit the ground hard, his horse bolting in panic. For one frozen moment, nothing happened. The men stared at their fallen companion, their minds trying to process what had just occurred. Then the canyon exploded into chaos. Nalin fired again and again, working the lever action with mechanical precision. Another rider went down, then another. The horses were screaming now, rearing and plunging, throwing their riders or crushing them against the canyon walls. Crane was shouting orders, trying to organize a response, but panic had set in. Men were abandoning their horses, diving for cover behind rocks, returning fire blindly at the walls above. And through it all, Nalin kept shooting, methodical, relentless, every shot calculated, every bullet finding flesh. 3 riders broke away from the main group and spurred their horses toward the north entrance, toward escape. Toward Tobias. He rose from behind his barricade with the shotgun in his hands. The range was maybe 20 feet. At that distance, the buckshot pattern was still tight, devastating. He pulled the first trigger, and the lead rider simply ceased to exist, from the chest up transformed into red mist and tumbling meat. The horse kept running for 3 more strides before it realized its rider was gone. Tobias broke the action, ejecting the spent shell, and pulled the second trigger. The second rider took the full load in the stomach and folded in half, sliding off his horse to land in a heap. The third rider had seen what happened to his companions and was trying desperately to stop, to turn, to go anywhere but forward. But momentum and terror had his horse beyond control. Tobias dropped the empty shotgun and drew the Colt smooth and fast. He fired twice. The first shot hit the horse in the chest, and the animal went down like its legs had been cut from under it. The rider flew over the horse's head and landed hard enough that Tobias heard bones break. The man tried to get up, fumbling for his pistol. Tobias shot him in the chest. He stopped moving. Behind him, the gunfire in the canyon was intensifying. Men had found cover and were shooting back now, spraying the east wall with rifle fire, trying to suppress Nalin's position. Tobias could hear bullets ricocheting off rock, whining away into empty air. He reloaded the Colt with quick, practiced movements, then turned his attention back to the canyon. Through the gun smoke and dust, he could see bodies on the ground. 4, maybe 5. That left 4 or 5 still fighting, plus Crane. Not good enough. They needed to break the enemy completely, send them running in terror, or this would turn into a siege that Tobias and Nalin could not win. He picked up the Winchester he had left near his barricade and began firing into the canyon, aiming for muzzle flashes, for movement, for anything that looked like a target. He did not know if he was hitting anything, but the volume of return fire slackened. Then he heard Nalin scream. It was not pain, not fear, but rage. Pure, undiluted fury. He looked up in time to see a man climbing the east wall using the same hidden path Nalin had used earlier. He was 20 feet below her position, moving fast, a pistol in his hand. Tobias brought the Winchester up and fired. Too late. The man was already above the angle of fire hidden by the overhang. More gunfire from above, different than before. The sharp crack of pistols rather than rifles. Nalin and the climber were fighting at close range. Tobias started running, heading back into the canyon, even though every instinct screamed at him to stay in cover. He could hear more men moving, could hear Crane's voice shouting orders, but none of that mattered. Nalin was in trouble. He reached the base of the east wall and looked up. The shelf was maybe 20 feet overhead, and he could see shadows moving up there, hear grunting and the sound of bodies struggling. Then a man appeared at the edge of the shelf, silhouetted against the sky. He teetered for a moment, arms windmilling, and then fell. He hit the canyon floor 10 feet from Tobias with a wet final sound. His neck was bent at an impossible angle. A knife was buried to the hilt in his chest, just below the sternum. Nalin's face appeared over the edge of the shelf, blood streaming from a cut above her eye. "I am all right," she called down. "Stay there." But Tobias was already climbing, using the same handholds she had shown him earlier. His shoulder protested every pull, every reach, but he ignored it. Pain was temporary. Death was permanent. He hauled himself onto the shelf and found Nayland kneeling, breathing hard, her hands shaking. The Winchester lay on the ground beside her, empty now. She had a pistol in her hand, one she must have taken from the dead man below. "How many left?" Tobias asked. "I counted 6 down. That leaves 5. Plus Crane." "Yes, plus Crane." They could hear the survivors below regrouping, and then Crane's voice rose above the others, clear and commanding. "McCrae, I know you are up there. I know you are listening. This was well done, I will grant you that. But you have not won. You have only made me angry." Tobias moved to the edge of the shelf and looked down. He could see Crane now standing in the open, apparently unconcerned about being shot. His gray coat was dusty and torn, and there was blood on his left sleeve, but he stood straight and proud. "You killed 7 of my men," Crane called up. 7 good men who deserved better than to die in this godforsaken hole. But I still have 5 left, and that is more than enough to finish this. So I will make you one final offer. Come down now, both of you, and I will make it quick. A bullet to the head, clean and fast. You have earned that much." "And if we refuse," Tobias shouted back. Crane smiled, and even from this distance, Tobias could see the coldness in it. "Then I will make it slow, and I will make the woman watch while I do it." Tobias looked at Nayland. Her face was set, determined, blood still dripping from the cut above her eye. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. "I think he is a liar and a dog. I think he will kill us slowly, no matter what we say." "Agreed." Tobias turned back to the canyon floor and cupped his hands around his mouth. "Here is my counter-offer, Crane. You and your men turn around and ride out of here. Leave us alone, forget the bounty, and maybe you live long enough to die of old age instead of bullet wounds." Crane laughed a sound without humor. "You have a high opinion of your position, Sergeant. Let me educate you. You are trapped on that shelf with nowhere to go. Your ammunition is running low. You have no food, no water, no way out. I can wait as long as it takes. Days if necessary. Eventually you will have to come down, and when you do, I will be waiting." "Maybe. Or maybe we shoot you right now and let your men decide if the bounty is worth dying for. You could try, but I am a hard man to kill. Ask the men who tried during the war. Oh, wait, you cannot, because they are all dead." Tobias raised the Winchester to his shoulder, sighting down the barrel at Crane's chest. It was a long shot, maybe 60 yards, and shooting downward made the angles tricky, but he was a good shot, and Crane was standing still, presenting a perfect target. His finger tightened on the trigger. Then Crane moved, stepping backward into cover behind a large boulder, and the moment was lost. "Thought so," Crane's voice echoed from behind the rock. "You are a soldier, McCrae. Soldiers follow rules even when those rules get them killed. Me, I learned a long time ago that the only rule that matters is survival." Gunfire erupted from 3 different positions as Crane's remaining men opened up on the shelf. Bullets struck all around them, chipping rock, sending fragments flying. Tobias and Nayland threw themselves flat, pressing into the stone as lead whined overhead. The fusillade lasted maybe 30 seconds, hundreds of rounds expended in one furious burst. When it stopped, Tobias's ears were ringing, and he could taste dust and powder smoke. "That was a warning," Crane called. "The next time we will not miss. Think about my offer. You have until sundown." Footsteps retreated. Voices faded. The canyon fell silent except for the moaning of wounded horses and the rasp of their own breathing. Tobias rolled onto his back and stared up at the sky. A hawk was circling overhead, riding the thermals, hunting. It did not care about the dead men below or the living men trapped on a shelf of rock. It just hunted and flew and existed in the eternal present that animals inhabited. He envied it. "We cannot stay here," Nayland said. She was sitting up, checking herself for wounds. The cut above her eye was still bleeding, but not badly. "He is right. We have no water, no food. If we stay, we die. And if we go down, we die faster. Then what do we do? Tobias sat up and looked around the shelf, really seeing it for the first time. It was deeper than he had initially thought, extending back into a shallow cave in the rock face, and at the back of that cave was a crack maybe 2 feet wide that seemed to go up into darkness. "What is that?" he asked, pointing. Nyland followed his gaze. "A chimney. The rock is fractured here, broken into vertical cracks. Some of them go all the way to the top. Can we climb it? Maybe. If we are strong enough and lucky enough and willing to risk a 60-foot fall." Tobias thought about it. They were trapped here with limited ammunition, no supplies and enemies waiting below. Their options were to surrender to die fighting or to try something desperate and possibly suicidal. When he put it that way, the choice seemed obvious. "Let us see how far it goes," he said. They gathered what little they had. The Winchester with maybe 20 rounds left. The Colt with 4 rounds in the cylinder. A canteen that was 3/4 empty. A knife each. That was all. The crack in the rock was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. Inside it was dark and cold, the stone pressing close on all sides. Tobias went first, working his way upward by pressing his back against one wall and his feet against the other, inching along in a painful, exhausting process. His shoulders screamed in protest. His legs began to shake from the effort. But he kept climbing because the alternative was unthinkable. Behind him, he could hear Nyland following her breath, coming in sharp gasps. Once she slipped and slid back several feet before catching herself, and Tobias's heart stopped until he heard her cursing softly in Apache. Up they climbed, foot by foot, inch by inch. Tobias lost track of time. His world narrowed to the next handhold, the next push, the next moment of not falling. Then suddenly the crack widened, and light was filtering down from above, and he could see sky. He hauled himself up the last few feet and emerged onto the top of the canyon wall, gasping like a drowning man. The air tasted sweet and clean and impossibly precious. Nyland came up behind him moments later, her hands bleeding from gripping sharp rock. They lay side by side on the stone, too exhausted to move, staring up at clouds that drifted past overhead. "We made it," Nyland said. "Part of the way." "What do you mean?" Tobias sat up and looked around. They were on top of the east wall of the canyon, maybe 50 feet above the floor. From here he could see for miles in every direction. The ranch, or what was left of it, was visible to the south, still smoking. And camped near the south entrance to the canyon were 4 men waiting. Not 5. 4. Crane had sent one of them away, probably to get reinforcements or to report back to whoever had hired him. Either way, it meant they were running out of time. "We need to move," Tobias said. "Put distance between us and them while we still can. Where do we go?" "East, into the high country. There are old mining camps up there, abandoned, but still standing. We can find shelter, gather our strength, figure out our next move." "And Crane?" "Crane will follow. Men like him always do. But we will choose the ground next time, and next time we will be ready." They walked east across broken rock and patches of snow, moving as fast as Nyland's injured leg would allow. Behind them, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood. Ahead, the mountains rose dark and formidable, promising nothing but more hardship and more struggle. But they were alive. Against all odds, despite all the mathematics of violence and death, they were still breathing. And sometimes Tobias thought that was enough. They walked through the night, putting miles between themselves and the canyon. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to see by, and they used every hour of darkness to their advantage. When dawn came, they were in the high country, surrounded by pine trees and granite outcroppings, far from any trail. Tobias called a halt in a small clearing, sheltered by rock on 3 sides. They had not eaten in nearly a day, and his stomach was a tight knot of emptiness. But they had water from a creek they had crossed, and that would have to be enough. They slept in shifts 2 hours each, the Winchester always in reach. When it was Tobias's turn to rest, he fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the kind that came from complete exhaustion. When Nalin woke him, the sun was high and warm, melting the frost from the rocks. "How far did we come?" she asked. 6 miles, maybe 7. Not far enough if Crane is determined." "Do you think he is—" Tobias thought about the cold certainty in Crane's eyes, the way he had stood in the open canyon and made his threats without a trace of fear or doubt. "Yes," he said, "men like him do not know when to quit. It is what makes them dangerous. It is also what gets them killed." They spent the day scouting the area, looking for defensible positions and escape routes. Tobias found an old trapper's cabin half collapsed against a hillside, the roof caved in, but the walls still solid. It would provide cover if they needed it. By evening they had a plan of sorts. They would wait here one more day, resting and recovering their strength. If Crane did not appear, they would move deeper into the mountains, putting enough distance between them that pursuit became impractical. If he did appear, they would make him pay for every step forward. That night they built a small fire hidden in a depression where the light would not be visible from more than a few dozen yards away. Nalin cooked the last of their jerky in the coals, and they ate it slowly, making it last. "Tell me about the war," she said. Tobias had been expecting this question, or one like it. He had spoken of the war before, but never in detail, never in a way that let someone see the truth of it. "What do you want to know? Why you fought? What you believed? Whether it was worth it?" Those were hard questions, the kind that did not have easy answers. Tobias stared into the fire and tried to find words for things he had buried a long time ago. "I was 19 when I enlisted," he said finally. "The country was tearing itself apart, and I thought I could help put it back together. I believed in the Union and the idea that we were one nation and not two. I believed slavery was wrong and had to be ended." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "For the first year, I still believed that. We were doing something important, something that mattered. But then I saw Chickamauga, saw 20,000 men die in 2 days over ground that neither side could hold, saw boys my age screaming for their mothers while they bled out in the mud, and I started to wonder if anything was worth that much blood." "But you kept fighting." "I did, because by then it was not about belief anymore. It was about the men beside me, about not letting them down, about surviving one more day so I could go home and try to forget." He fell silent, lost in memories that would never quite fade. The sound of artillery, the smell of gangrene, the faces of men he had killed and men he had failed to save. "Did you forget?" Nalin asked softly. "No, you never forget. You just learn to live with it." She nodded as if she understood, and maybe she did. Her people had their own wars, their own litany of loss and suffering, different names, different causes, but the same fundamental truth underneath. Violence changed you. It carved away pieces of who you were and left something harder and colder in their place. "My people have been at war for as long as anyone can remember," she said. "First with other tribes, then with the Spanish, then with your people, always fighting, always dying, always losing ground. My grandfather used to say that we were like water running downhill. We could change direction, but we could not stop moving toward the sea." What did he mean? That our destruction was inevitable. That no matter how hard we fought or how clever we were, eventually the white men would have all the land, and we would have nothing. He died believing that. Maybe he was right. Tobias wanted to tell her she was wrong, that there was hope that things could change. But he had seen too much of the world to lie to her. The truth was that her people were being ground down by forces too large and too relentless to resist. History was a brutal thing, and it did not care about justice or mercy. "What will you do," he asked, "when this is over, if we survive?" Nalin stared into the fire, her face shadowed and hard to read. "I do not know. I have no home to return to, no family that will take me. I am Apache but not Apache, white but not white. I belong nowhere." "You could come with me. If I survive this, I will rebuild the ranch. It will not be much, but it will be honest work, a place to be." She looked at him with those dark, fierce eyes. "Why would you offer that?" "Because I think we are the same, you and I. Both of us trying to figure out how to keep living when everything we cared about has been taken away. Maybe we could do that together, as partners. Not husband and wife, not unless you wanted that, but I would not ask for it. What I am offering is simpler, a partnership based on respect. You work half shares, we build something together, no obligations beyond that." Nalin was quiet for a long time, and Tobias could see her turning the idea over in her mind, examining it from every angle. "I will think about it," she said finally. That night Tobias took the first watch, sitting with his back against a tree, the Winchester across his lap. The forest was alive with night sounds, owls calling, small animals rustling in the underbrush, the wind sighing through the pines like something breathing. He thought about Sarah and Emma, as he did every night. But for the first time in 7 years, thinking about them did not feel like being stabbed. It felt more like remembering people he had loved, acknowledging their absence without being destroyed by it. Maybe that was progress. Maybe that was healing. Or maybe he was just too tired to hurt anymore. Around midnight he heard something that was not a forest sound. Horse moving through trees, trying to be quiet but not quite managing it. Then voices low and cautious. Tobias moved silently to where Nalin was sleeping and touched her shoulder. She woke instantly, reaching for the knife before her eyes were fully open. "Someone is coming," he whispered. They gathered their few possessions and melted into the darkness, moving away from the camp without a sound. Tobias had chosen this position specifically because it had multiple escape routes, and now he was grateful for that foresight. They climbed higher into the rocks, finding a vantage point where they could see the camp below without being seen. 3 riders appeared moving slowly through the trees, backlit by moonlight. Even from this distance, Tobias recognized one of them, the gray coat, the silver hair, the burned face. Virgil Crane had found them. The riders reached the abandoned camp and stopped. One of them dismounted and examined the fire pit, feeling for warmth. He said something to Crane, who nodded and began scanning the surrounding darkness. For one terrible moment, Tobias thought Crane was looking right at them. Then the man turned away and remounted his horse. The 3 riders moved off to the north, still searching. They had lost the trail, but were casting about trying to pick it up again. Tobias waited until they were out of sight, then waited some more. Patience had kept him alive through 4 years of war. It would keep him alive now. When he was certain the riders were gone, he and Nalin descended from their hiding place and headed south, back the way they had come. It was the last direction Crane would expect them to go. They walked until dawn, then found another place to hide and rest. This time, Tobias did not allow a fire. They ate handfuls of snow and tried to sleep, though neither of them managed more than fitful dozing. "He will not stop," Nalin said during Tobias's watch. "No, he will not. Then we have to kill him, not his men, him, cut off the head and the body dies." Tobias knew she was right. As long as Crane lived, this would never be over. They could run to Mexico, to California, to the ends of the earth, and Crane would follow. Because for him, this had stopped being about $50. Now it was about pride, about not being beaten by a broken-down ex-soldier and an Apache woman. "Tomorrow night," Tobias said, "we go back to the canyon. We know that Ground and Crane will have to return there eventually to collect his dead. When he does, we will be waiting. And then we finish this." They spent the next day preparing. Tobias cleaned and oiled the Winchester, checked every cartridge, made sure the action moved smooth as water. He had perhaps 15 rounds left. Not many, but enough if he was careful. The Colt had 4 rounds. The knife was sharp. It would have to be enough. As dusk fell, they began moving toward the canyon, taking a wide circling route to avoid leaving tracks. The journey took hours, and by the time they reached the south rim of Broken Spine, it was full dark. They descended carefully to the canyon floor, moving between the bodies that still lay where they had fallen. Crane had not returned to collect them yet, and the scavengers had been at work. Coyotes, ravens, the inevitable cycle of death and decay. Tobias tried not to look at the faces. They had been men once, with names and histories, and people who cared whether they lived or died. Now they were just meat returning to the earth. He and Nayland took up positions on opposite sides of the canyon entrance, hidden in deep shadow where they could watch the approaches. Then they waited. The night was cold and clear, the stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Tobias's breath steamed white in the moonlight. His shoulder ached, his stomach was empty, but his mind was clear and his hands were steady. Around midnight he heard them coming. Not 3 riders this time, but 2, Crane and one other man riding slowly, cautiously, weapons drawn. They entered the canyon and stopped looking around at the carnage. The other man said something, and Crane replied, his voice carrying in the still air. "Collect what you can. Weapons, ammunition, anything useful. Leave the bodies." The other man dismounted and began moving among the dead, rifling through their belongings. Crane stayed mounted, his eyes scanning the canyon walls, the shadows, the places where danger might hide. He knew. Somehow he knew this was a trap. Tobias waited until the other man was bent over a corpse, his back turned. Then he rose from cover with the Winchester and fired. The shot took the man high in the back between the shoulder blades. He collapsed without a sound. Crane reacted with astonishing speed, dropping from his horse and rolling behind cover in one fluid motion. His own rifle barked twice bullets, striking rock near Tobias's position, forcing him down. Then Crane was moving low and fast, using every scrap of cover, working his way toward Tobias's position with the skill of a man who had survived 100 fights. Tobias tried to track him, but could not get a clear shot. He moved back deeper into the rocks and felt, rather than saw, Nalin moving on the opposite side of the canyon, trying to flank Crane. A rifle cracked from somewhere in the darkness. Tobias felt the bullet pass so close to his head that he heard the angry wasp buzz of its passage. He dropped flat and scrambled behind a boulder. "You are good, McCrae," Crane's voice echoed off the canyon walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Better than I gave you credit for, but you made one mistake." Tobias did not respond. Words were just a distraction. "You should have run," Crane continued. "Kept running and never looked back. But you had to be a hero, had to stand up for the Apache girl. And now you are going to die for it." More movement, the whisper of boots on stone. Crane was circling, trying to get behind him. Tobias turned slowly, keeping the boulder between himself and the sound. Then Nayland fired 3 quick shots from her position on the east wall. One of them must have come close because Tobias heard Crane curse and return fire. In that moment, with Crane's attention divided, Tobias moved. He came around the boulder fast and low, the Winchester up and ready. He saw Crane's silhouette against the moonlight, maybe 30 feet away, partially hidden behind a dead tree. Tobias fired without hesitation. The Winchester's report echoed like thunder. The bullet struck the tree trunk, exploding splinters, but missed Crane by inches. Crane spun and fired back the muzzle flash, bright in the darkness. Tobias felt something punch him in the left side just above his hip. Not painful at first, just pressure, like someone had poked him hard with a stick. Then the heat came spreading through his body like liquid fire. He had been shot before. He knew what it meant. Knew he had minutes, maybe less, before shock set in and his body stopped obeying him. He worked the Winchester's lever, ejecting the spent cartridge, chambering another round. His hands were slick with blood, now making the rifle slippery. He wiped them on his coat and tried again. Crane was advancing, confident now, knowing his shot had struck home. He moved into the open, rifle raised. "That is the war teaching you," Crane called. "Never hesitate. Never give your enemy a second chance." Tobias raised the Winchester, but his hands were shaking too badly to aim. The rifle wavered the barrel, describing useless circles in the air. Then Nayland was there, seeming to materialize from shadow like a ghost. She had come down from her position, moving silent as smoke, and now she stood 10 feet behind Crane, with the Colt in both hands. "Crane," she said quietly. He spun, trying to bring his rifle to bear, but he was too slow and she was too close. She fired once. The bullet took him in the chest, punching through the gray coat, through flesh and bone, and into the vital machinery beneath. Crane staggered backward, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers. He looked down at the blood spreading across his coat with an expression of profound surprise. "Should have aimed higher," he said. Then his legs gave out, and he sat down hard in the dirt. Nayland walked over to him, the pistol still raised, and stood looking down at the man who had hunted her across 300 miles of wilderness. "It is over," she said. Crane laughed, though it came out wet and broken. Blood bubbled on his lips. "Nothing is ever over, girl. There will always be another bounty hunter, another man willing to kill for money. You will never be safe." "Maybe not, but you will not be there to see it." His eyes closed. His breathing grew ragged, then stopped. Virgil Crane, former captain of the Confederate States Army bounty hunter and killer of men, died sitting in the dirt of a frozen canyon under stars that did not care. Nayland lowered the pistol and turned to where Tobias had collapsed against the rocks. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands immediately going to the wound. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough. Gut shot. You know what that means." She did. They both did. A bullet in the stomach was a death sentence, unless you had a surgeon nearby, and they were 2 days from the nearest town. "We have to try," she said. "I will not let you die, not after everything." She tore strips from her shirt and packed the wound as best she could, but the blood kept coming, soaking through the bandages as fast as she could apply them. Tobias could feel his strength draining away, his vision narrowing to a tunnel. "Listen to me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Take the horses. Ride south. There is a town called Red River, maybe 40 miles. Find a marshal, tell him what happened. He will help you. I am not leaving you. You have to. I am dying, Nayland, but you do not have to. You can live. You can have the life you deserve. You said we were partners. Partners do not leave each other behind." Tobias tried to argue, but the pain was too intense and the darkness was closing in. He felt her hands on his face, felt her lifting his head into her lap. "Stay with me," she was saying. "Please, Tobias, stay with me." He wanted to. God, how he wanted to. But the darkness was so heavy, and he was so tired of fighting. The last thing he heard before consciousness left him was Nayland's voice, fierce and desperate, calling him back from the edge. Then there was nothing. Tobias woke to sunlight and pain. The pain came first, a white-hot agony in his gut that made him gasp and try to curl into himself. But hands held him down, gentle but firm. "Do not move," a voice said. "You will tear the stitches." He opened his eyes and found himself staring up at wooden rafters. He was lying on a bed, a real bed, in a room he did not recognize. The air smelled of wood smoke and medicine. "Where am I?" His voice came out as a croak. "Red River. The doctor's house. You have been unconscious for 3 days." He turned his head carefully and saw Nayland sitting beside the bed. Her face was drawn and exhausted, her eyes red from lack of sleep. But she was smiling. "You should be dead," she said. "The doctor said the bullet missed your intestines by a fraction of an inch. Another quarter turn and you would have bled out in that canyon." "How did I get here?" "I carried you to one of Crane's horses and tied you into the saddle. Then I rode for 2 straight days. I did not think we would make it. You kept trying to fall off." Tobias tried to process this. Nayland had carried him, a man who outweighed her by 60 pounds, out of the canyon and onto a horse. Then she had ridden for 2 days through hostile country, keeping him alive through sheer force of will. "You saved my life," he said. "You saved mine first. I was returning the favor." A different voice spoke from the doorway. "If you two are done congratulating each other, maybe we could discuss what happens next." Tobias turned his head and saw a man in a brown suit standing there. He was middle-aged with gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too much but kept showing up anyway. A tin star was pinned to his vest. "Marshal Garrett," the man said, moving into the room. "I have been hearing some interesting stories from your companion here, stories about bounty hunters and ambushes and a man named Virgil Crane. I found his body in the canyon along with 12 others. That is a lot of dead men, Mr. McCrae. They were trying to kill us." "So Miss Nayland has explained, and I believe her. Crane was known to me, and not in a good way. The territory is better off without him, but there are questions that need answering, such as why 13 armed men were chasing you across the wilderness in the first place." Nayland spoke up before Tobias could answer. "There was a bounty on me, $50 dead or alive. Crane was hired to collect it." "Yes, I know about the bounty. It was posted by the Army based on accusations from 2 dead bounty hunters. As far as I am concerned, those accusations died with them. There is no outstanding warrant for your arrest." Tobias felt relief wash through him, followed by suspicion. Things were never that simple. "What is the catch?" he asked. Marshal Garrett smiled thinly. "No catch, but I would strongly suggest that both of you stay out of trouble from now on. I can only look the other way so many times." "We will," Tobias promised. The marshal nodded and left, and Nayland came back to sit beside the bed. The weeks that followed were slow. Tobias learned to walk again, first with Nayland's shoulder to lean on, then with a cane, then finally on his own. The wound healed, leaving a puckered scar just above his hip that would ache when it rained for the rest of his life. They worked to pay off the doctor's bill. Nayland cooked and cleaned in the boarding house. Tobias, once he could stand for more than an hour, repaired fences and mucked stalls at the livery. It was honest work. It was enough. 6 weeks after Tobias had woken in that narrow-bed spring came to the high country in earnest. The snow melted. The rivers ran high and wild with snowmelt. The aspens began to bud, and the air smelled of pine and possibility. On a morning in early April, they stood in the street outside the boarding house. 2 horses waited saddled and loaded with supplies. A pack mule carried tools, seed, and everything they would need to start over. "You are sure about this?" Nayland asked. "No," Tobias said. "But I am doing it anyway." They rode north together, taking their time stopping to rest, when Tobias's side began to ache. It took them 2 days to reach what had been Red Willow Ranch. The cabin was gone. The barn was gone. Everything Tobias had built over 15 years had been reduced to ash and blackened timber. But the land was still there. The well still worked. The 2 graves on the hill were untouched by fire. Tobias stood looking at the crosses for a long time. Nayland waited beside him, not speaking. "I used to think this place was their tomb," he said finally. "Now I think maybe it can be something else." "What?" "A beginning." They worked through the spring, clearing debris, cutting new logs from the forest, laying foundations. It was back-breaking labor, and Tobias's wound protested every evening, but it was good work, the kind that left you tired in your bones but satisfied in your soul. The cabin rose slowly, 1 log at a time, 1 day at a time. One evening, as the sun dropped toward the western mountains, they sat on the porch of the half-finished cabin and drank coffee. Nayland looked out at the land they had spent 2 months reclaiming from ash. "You never asked," she said. "Asked what? If I decided. About your offer." Tobias set down his cup. "I figured you would tell me when you were ready." She turned to face him, her dark eyes serious. "Half shares, equal partners, no obligations beyond work and respect." "That is what I said." She held out her hand. "Then we have an agreement." He took it. Her grip was strong, calloused the hand of someone who knew what work meant. They shook once, firm and final. "Partners," Tobias said. "Partners," Nayland agreed. They sat in comfortable silence as the light faded from gold to rose to purple. The land stretched out before them, empty and full of promise. Somewhere down the valley a coyote called. Another answered. Nayland stirred, reaching for the coffee pot. "There is something else. Marshal Garrett sent word last week. A Comanchero band is moving through the territory, raiding homesteads, stealing horses and cattle. They might come this way." Tobias looked at her. "Are you worried?" "No." She smiled just a little. "We have faced worse." "That we have." He thought about Virgil Crane and his 12 men, about the canyon and the fire and the blood, about how close they had come to dying a dozen times over. And he thought about how they were still here, still breathing, still building. "Let them come," he said quietly. "We will be ready." The stars came out one by one, filling the sky with cold light. A hawk circled overhead, hunting in the dusk. The wind carried the smell of pine and fresh-cut wood and the promise of summer. On the porch of the half-built cabin, 2 people who had been broken by the world sat together and watched the darkness come unafraid. They had found each other in fire and blood. They had survived when survival seemed impossible. And now they were building something new from the ashes of what had been lost. It was not much, but it was theirs. And that was enough, the end.